In the scorching heat of the Arizona desert, where most men would die within hours without water, Samuel Creek had built a life of solitude. For 15 years, he had worked his small ranch alone, speaking only to his cattle and the occasional trader who passed through. But, on that fateful morning in 1887, when two enormous figures appeared on his horizon like mirages come to life, Samuel had no idea that a single act of kindness would change not just his life, but the destiny of an entire Apache tribe. What started as offering water to two dying strangers would unleash a chain of events so extraordinary that tribal elders would speak of it for generations. Some called it magic. Others called it destiny. But, for Samuel Creek, it was the beginning of a journey that would test everything he believed about family, loyalty, and the mysterious forces that bind human hearts together. Samuel Creek wiped the sweat from his forehead as he checked the fence line for the third time that morning. The Arizona sun was merciless, even in early October, and his small cattle ranch demanded constant attention. At 42 years old, Samuel had grown comfortable with silence. His nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away, and most days passed without him speaking to another human soul. He had chosen this isolated life deliberately. After losing his wife Martha and their unborn child to fever 7 years earlier, Samuel found peace only in the endless routine of ranch work. Every morning, he would wake before dawn, tend to his 40 head of cattle, repair whatever the desert wind had broken overnight, and fall asleep to the sound of coyotes calling across the vast emptiness. That morning started like any other. Samuel was mending a section of fence when he noticed something strange on the eastern horizon. At first, he thought it might be a dust devil, but the movement was too purposeful, too steady. Squinting against the bright sunlight, he made out two figures walking toward his property. Even from a distance, something about them seemed unusual. They moved with a strange, synchronized gait, as if they were connected by invisible threads. Samuel set down his tools and walked toward his small adobe house, where he kept a loaded rifle by the door. Living alone in Apache territory meant staying alert. While most of the local tribes had been relocated to reservations, rogue bands still roamed the desert, and not all encounters with strangers ended peacefully. As the figures drew closer, Samuel realized why they had seemed so strange from afar. These were not ordinary men. Both stood at least 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and powerful builds that made them look like giants against the desert landscape. They wore simple leather clothing and walked barefoot across the rocky ground without any sign of discomfort. What struck Samuel most was how identical they appeared. Same height, same build, same long black hair hanging past their shoulders. Twins, he realized, though he had never seen twins of such enormous size. They moved with perfect coordination, their steps matching exactly, their arms swinging in unison. The morning sun climbed higher as the giants approached, and Samuel could see they were struggling. Their movements, while still synchronized, had become labored. Dark stains on their leather shirts suggested they had been walking for a long time without water. In the desert, that usually meant death within hours. Samuel found himself facing a decision that would change everything. His practical mind warned him to stay inside, to let these strangers pass by his property without interference. He had survived 15 years in this harsh land by avoiding unnecessary risks. Getting involved with desperate travelers often led to trouble, especially when those travelers looked like they could tear a man apart with their bare hands. But something deeper than caution stirred in Samuel's chest as he watched the two giants stumble slightly, their perfect coordination faltering for the first time. They were dying of thirst, and, despite their intimidating size, they were simply human beings in need of help. Martha had always said that kindness was never wasted, even when it seemed dangerous. God puts people in our path for a reason, she used to tell him. Sometimes we're meant to help, and sometimes we're meant to be helped. The trick is knowing which is which. Samuel made his choice. He walked back to his well, drew up a fresh bucket of cool water, and carried it toward the fence line where the giants would pass. The water was precious in this dry land, but he had enough. These men clearly had none. When the twins reached his property line, Samuel called out to them in English, then tried the few Spanish words he knew. Neither man responded, but both stopped walking and turned their enormous heads toward him. Up close, their size was even more impressive. Each man probably weighed 300 pounds, all of it muscle and bone. Their faces were weathered by sun and wind, with high cheekbones and deep-set dark eyes that held an intelligence Samuel had not expected. The twins looked at each other in a way that suggested they were communicating without words. After a long moment, they turned back to Samuel and walked slowly toward the fence. Their movements remained perfectly synchronized, even in their weakened state. Samuel held up the bucket of water and gestured for them to drink. The first giant reached the fence and stopped, his dark eyes fixed on Samuel's face as if trying to read his intentions. Samuel dipped a metal cup into the bucket and offered it through the fence rails. The giant accepted the cup with hands that could have crushed Samuel's skull, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He drank slowly, savoring each sip, then passed the cup to his twin. They shared the water equally, taking turns until the cup was empty. Samuel immediately refilled it, and they repeated the process. As they drank, Samuel noticed details that made these men even more mysterious. Both wore identical necklaces made of small bones and polished stones. Intricate tattoos covered their arms, depicting symbols Samuel had never seen before. Most strangely, each man had a scar across his left palm that looked deliberately made, as if it were part of some ritual. When the twins had drunk their fill, they stepped back from the fence and began speaking to each other in a language Samuel did not recognize. It sounded nothing like the Apache dialects he had heard before, nor like Spanish or any other language he knew. The sounds were deep and rhythmic, almost musical. The conversation lasted several minutes, with both men occasionally glancing at Samuel. Finally, the first giant approached the fence again and placed his large hand over his heart. He spoke a single word in accented but clear English, "Brothers." Samuel was not sure what the man meant. Were they telling him they were brothers to each other, or were they claiming some kind of kinship with him? Before he could ask, both giants stepped back and began walking away, continuing their journey across the desert. But something had changed in their movements. Where before they had seemed to be fleeing something or desperately seeking something, now they walked with purpose and direction. The water had clearly saved their lives, but it seemed to have given them more than physical strength. It was as if they had found what they were looking for. Samuel watched them disappear into the shimmering heat waves rising from the desert floor. He stood by his fence for a long time, wondering about the strange encounter. Who were these men? Where had they come from, and where were they going? Why had they seemed so familiar with each other that they moved like two parts of the same person? That night, as Samuel lay in his bed listening to the usual sounds of the desert, he found himself thinking about the word the giant had spoken, brothers. The way the man had said it, with his hand over his heart and his eyes fixed on Samuel's face, suggested it meant more than simple familial relationship. In the days that followed, Samuel found himself watching the eastern horizon, half expecting to see the giants return. He told himself it was simple curiosity, but he knew it was more than that. The encounter had stirred something in him that had been dormant since Martha's death. For the first time in years, he felt connected to something larger than his daily routine of survival. A week passed without any sign of the twins. Samuel began to convince himself that the encounter had been less significant than it had seemed at the time. Perhaps he had simply helped two lost travelers, and that was the end of it. Life on the ranch returned to its normal rhythm of feeding cattle, mending fences, and enduring the endless heat. But, on the 8th day after the giants had appeared, Samuel woke to find something that made his blood run cold. Placed carefully on his porch, arranged in a perfect circle, were 7 dead rattlesnakes. Each snake had been killed with a single, precise cut to the head. In the center of the circle lay a small pouch made of soft leather. Samuel approached the strange display carefully, his rifle in his hands. The snakes were still fresh, killed sometime during the night while he slept. The fact that someone had been able to approach his house without waking him was deeply unsettling. He was a light sleeper, trained by years of living alone to wake at the smallest unusual sound. Inside the leather pouch, Samuel found a collection of items that made no immediate sense: 3 smooth river stones, a piece of polished turquoise, a small carved bone that looked like a miniature animal, and a braid of sweet grass tied with sinew. There was also a folded piece of paper with symbols drawn in what looked like charcoal. The symbols meant nothing to Samuel, but something about their arrangement suggested they were meant to convey a message. The lines and curves had a deliberate quality, as if they formed words in a language he could not read. At the bottom of the paper, drawn in the same charcoal, was a perfect representation of his well, complete with the wooden bucket he had used to give the giants water. Samuel spent the morning puzzling over the gifts, if that's what they were. The rattlesnakes bothered him most. In his experience, killing 7 rattlesnakes in a single night required either incredible skill or incredible luck. The precision of the cuts suggested skill, but the fact that someone had done it silently, near his house, while he slept, suggested something beyond normal human ability. As the day wore on, Samuel began to notice other changes around his property. His cattle, usually scattered across his grazing land, had gathered in a tight group near the house. They seemed nervous, constantly raising their heads to look toward the eastern desert. Even more strangely, he had not heard a single coyote call the previous night, which was unprecedented in his 15 years on the ranch. That evening, as Samuel sat on his porch cleaning his rifle, he saw smoke rising from the eastern horizon. Not the thin, dispersed smoke of a brush fire, but a thick, straight column that suggested a large, well-built fire. The smoke continued through the night, visible against the stars, and Samuel found himself unable to sleep. He had the distinct feeling that events were moving around him, that the simple act of giving water to 2 strangers had set something in motion that he did not understand. The rational part of his mind insisted that he was reading too much into coincidences, but 15 years of surviving alone in hostile territory had taught him to trust his instincts. His instincts were telling him that his life was about to change in ways he could not imagine. The giants had not simply passed through his land. They had marked it, claimed it, or blessed it in some way that carried significance beyond his understanding. The gifts on his porch, the dead rattlesnakes, the strange behavior of his animals, all pointed to the same conclusion: his encounter with the twins had been the beginning of something, not the end. Samuel cleaned his rifle with extra care that night and made sure his ammunition was easily accessible. Whatever was coming, he intended to be ready for it. But, as he finally drifted off to sleep in the early hours of morning, he realized that no amount of preparation could ready him for forces he did not understand. The last thing he remembered before sleep took him was the sound of drums beating somewhere in the eastern desert, so faint he might have imagined them, but perfectly synchronized, like the footsteps of giant twins walking in perfect unison across the endless, mysterious landscape of his new reality. Samuel woke the next morning to find his cattle dead. Not all of them, but 7 head lay scattered across his grazing land, each one killed in exactly the same way as the rattlesnakes had been. A single, precise cut to the throat, so clean and quick that the animals showed no signs of struggle. The remaining cattle huddled together near the barn, refusing to venture into the open pasture. Samuel walked among the dead animals with his rifle ready, scanning the horizon for any sign of the attackers. But, the more he examined the scene, the more puzzled he became. The cuts were too precise, too clean to have been made by any weapon he knew. More troubling still, there were no tracks around the dead cattle. No footprints, no disturbed earth, nothing to indicate how the killers had approached or departed. As he knelt beside the nearest dead steer, Samuel noticed something that made his hands tremble. Carved into the animal's forehead, so shallow it was barely visible, was one of the symbols from the paper he had found the day before. The same curved lines and intersecting circles, etched with something sharp enough to mark flesh but not deep enough to cause bleeding. Samuel spent the morning dragging the dead cattle away from his house, though he knew the effort was probably pointless. Whatever forces were at work around his ranch clearly possessed abilities far beyond anything he could defend against with normal means. The precision of the kills, the absence of tracks, the strange symbols, all pointed to something supernatural or at least beyond his understanding. As he worked, Samuel found himself remembering stories Martha used to tell about her grandmother, who claimed to have witnessed strange events in these same desert lands. According to the old woman, certain places held power that could manifest in ways that defied explanation. She had spoken of giant spirits that walked the earth in human form, testing the hearts of mortals and rewarding kindness with blessings that could last for generations. At the time, Samuel had dismissed these stories as folklore, the kind of tales that grew and changed with each telling until they bore no resemblance to whatever small truth might have inspired them. But, standing among his dead cattle, looking at symbols carved by invisible hands, he began to wonder if Martha's grandmother had known more about the true nature of this land than he had given her credit for. That afternoon, as Samuel sat on his porch trying to make sense of the morning's discoveries, he saw riders approaching from the south. 3 men on horseback, moving at a steady pace across the desert floor. As they drew closer, Samuel recognized them as members of the local Apache tribe, though he had never seen these particular men before. The lead rider was elderly, with long gray hair braided with beads and feathers. His face was deeply lined by sun and wind, but his dark eyes held an alertness that suggested sharp intelligence. The 2 men riding behind him were younger, probably warriors, though they carried no visible weapons. Samuel remained seated on his porch, his rifle across his knees, as the 3 Apaches rode up to his fence. In his 15 years on the ranch, he had learned that showing either fear or aggression in such encounters usually led to trouble. Better to appear calm and ready without seeming threatening. The elderly Apache spoke first, in surprisingly good English. "You are the man who gave water to the Thunder Twins." Samuel felt his heart skip a beat. Thunder Twins. So these riders knew about his encounter with the giants. "I gave water to 2 men who were thirsty," he replied carefully. "I don't know what they're called." The old Apache nodded slowly. "I am White Eagle, shaman of the Chiricahua band. These are my sons, Running Bear and Silent Wolf. We have come because the Thunder Twins have returned to our people after many years of absence." "Thunder Twins?" Samuel asked, though part of him already understood. White Eagle dismounted from his horse and approached the fence. Despite his apparent age, he moved with the fluid grace of a much younger man. "In our traditions, the Thunder Twins are sacred beings who walk the earth in times of great change. They test the hearts of men, seeking those who show kindness without hope of reward. When they find such a person, they mark that place as sacred ground." Samuel looked toward his dead cattle, then back at the shaman. "If this place is sacred, why did something kill my animals?" "Because you do not yet understand what has been given to you," White Eagle replied. "The Thunder Twins have chosen you as their earthly brother. This brings great power, but also great responsibility. The cattle were a sacrifice, an offering to seal the bond between you and the spirits of this land." "I don't want any bond with spirits," Samuel said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they were not entirely true. Something deep inside him had awakened during his encounter with the giants, a longing he had thought died with Martha. White Eagle studied Samuel's face for a long moment. "The choice has already been made. The Thunder Twins do not ask permission. They choose those whose hearts call to them, whether those men understand it or not. You can fight against this destiny, but doing so will bring only suffering to you and to others." One of the younger Apaches, Running Bear, spoke for the first time. "Show him the vision, Father. Let him see what the spirits have shown us." White Eagle nodded and reached into a leather pouch hanging from his belt. He withdrew a handful of what looked like dried herbs and small bones. "Give me your hand," he said to Samuel. Samuel hesitated. Accepting anything from an Apache shaman felt like crossing a line he might not be able to uncross. But his curiosity was stronger than his caution, and he found himself extending his left hand through the fence rails. White Eagle placed the herbs and bones in Samuel's palm, then covered both their hands with his own. The moment their skin touched, Samuel felt a jolt of electricity run up his arm and into his chest. The world around him began to blur and shift, as if he were looking through water. Suddenly, Samuel was no longer standing by his fence. He was floating high above the desert, looking down at the landscape spread out below him like a map. He could see his ranch, tiny and isolated in the vast expanse of rock and sand. But the land was different somehow, more alive, pulsing with currents of energy that flowed like rivers beneath the surface. As he watched, 2 enormous figures appeared on the eastern horizon. The Thunder Twins, but not as he had seen them before. Now they were revealed in their true form, beings of pure light and power who walked across the earth leaving footprints of starfire. Where they stepped, the dead desert bloomed with life. Springs bubbled up from dry ground, plants grew and flourished, animals gathered in abundance. The vision shifted, and Samuel saw himself standing by his well, offering water to the disguised spirits. As they drank, chains of light connected them to him, binding all three in a relationship that transcended normal human understanding. The light spread outward from the point of contact, flowing across the land like a blessing. But, with the blessing came responsibility. Samuel saw himself standing before gatherings of people, Apache and white settlers alike, serving as a bridge between two worlds. He saw conflicts resolved through his intervention, drought broken by his presence, enemies becoming friends through his mediation. The Thunder Twins had chosen him not just as their brother, but as their representative on Earth. The vision faded, and Samuel found himself back on his porch, White Eagle's hand still covering his. The shaman released his grip and stepped back, his dark eyes watching Samuel's face carefully. "Do you understand now?" White Eagle asked. Samuel's head was spinning, but one thing was clear. The giants, the Thunder Twins, they're coming back. "They are already here," White Eagle replied. "They have been walking among our people for 3 days, preparing them for what is to come. Tonight, there will be a great gathering at the sacred pool, 15 miles east of here. You are expected to attend." "What kind of gathering?" "A binding ceremony," White Eagle explained. "The Thunder Twins will formally claim you as their earthly brother, and you will accept the responsibilities that come with that honor. Our people will witness this bond and acknowledge your place in our spiritual community." Samuel felt panic rising in his chest. "I'm not Apache. I don't belong in your spiritual community." "The Thunder Twins do not recognize the divisions that separate men from each other," White Eagle said. "Apache, white, Mexican, these are human distinctions. The spirits see only the heart. Your heart has called to them, and they have answered. That makes you our brother, whether you were born among us or not." Silent Wolf, who had remained quiet throughout the conversation, now spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The drought that has plagued our land for 2 years ended the day you gave water to the Thunder Twins. Our sacred spring, dry for months, began flowing again that same night. The spirits have already begun to work through you." Samuel looked from one Apache face to another, seeing only sincerity and respect. These men were not trying to trick him or use him for some hidden purpose. They genuinely believed that his encounter with the giants had marked him as someone special, someone chosen for a purpose larger than himself. "What if I refuse to come to this ceremony?" Samuel asked. White Eagle's expression grew grave. "Then, the Thunder Twins will withdraw their blessing, and this land will return to the barren state it was in before their arrival. The springs will dry up, the animals will leave, and the desert will reclaim everything. But, more than that, you will have rejected a gift that comes only once in many generations. Such rejection brings consequences that extend far beyond one man's life." Samuel thought about his dead cattle, about the strange symbols and the gifts left on his porch. He thought about the loneliness that had consumed him since Martha's death and the sense of purpose that had awakened during his brief encounter with the giants. Maybe White Eagle was right. Maybe some choices were made for a person rather than by them. If I come to this ceremony, what exactly am I agreeing to? To serve as a bridge between the world of spirits and the world of men, White Eagle replied. To use the gifts the Thunder Twins will give you for the benefit of all people who come to you in need. To protect the sacred places and sacred beings that will be revealed to you. To live not just for yourself, but as part of the larger pattern that connects all life. Samuel was quiet for several minutes, weighing the enormity of what was being asked of him. His rational mind told him this was all superstition and coincidence, that he was allowing grief and loneliness to make him susceptible to elaborate stories that had no basis in reality. But his heart told him something different. His heart remembered the perfect synchronization of the giants' movements, the intelligence in their eyes, the way his animals had behaved since their visit. His heart remembered the impossible precision of the snake kills, the symbols that appeared from nowhere, the sudden return of water to dried springs. Most of all, his heart remembered the feeling of connection he had experienced when the giants looked into his eyes, a sense of belonging that he had not felt since Martha's death. I'll come, Samuel said finally. But I want to understand what I'm agreeing to before I make any permanent commitments. White Eagle smiled for the first time since arriving at the ranch. Understanding will come with experience. The Thunder Twins do not reveal their purposes all at once. They guide their chosen ones step by step along the path they are meant to walk. The three Apaches remounted their horses and prepared to leave. As they rode away, White Eagle called back to Samuel. "Follow the eastern star when it reaches its highest point tonight. The sacred pool lies in the direction of its light. The Thunder Twins will be waiting for you there." Samuel watched the riders disappear into the afternoon heat haze, then turned back to look at his ranch. Everything appeared normal: the small adobe house, the barn, the well, the remaining cattle grazing in the shade. But, beneath the surface normalcy, he could sense currents of change flowing like underground rivers, carrying him toward a destiny he had never imagined. That evening, as Samuel prepared for the journey to the sacred pool, he found himself thinking about Martha and what she would have said about this strange turn his life had taken. She had always believed that people were meant to be part of something larger than themselves, that isolation and self-reliance, while necessary for survival, were not enough to make a life meaningful. "Maybe this is your chance," he said aloud to her memory as he saddled his horse. "Maybe this is how I find my way back to the world." The eastern star was rising as Samuel mounted his horse and rode out into the desert night, following the light toward whatever waited for him at the sacred pool. Behind him, his ranch looked small and temporary against the vast landscape. Ahead of him lay the unknown, and, for the first time in years, Samuel felt eager to meet it. Samuel rode through the desert night guided only by starlight and an inexplicable sense of direction that seemed to pull him eastward. The landscape that appeared barren and hostile during daylight hours revealed a different character under the moon. Shadows created by rock formations and scattered vegetation formed patterns that almost seemed deliberate, as if the desert itself was directing his path toward the sacred pool. After riding for 2 hours, Samuel began to see flickering lights in the distance. As he drew closer, the lights resolved into a circle of torches surrounding a natural depression in the desert floor. The sacred pool, he realized, was not actually a pool of water but rather a circular clearing bordered by smooth boulders, with a small spring bubbling up from the center. Around the perimeter of the circle, Samuel counted perhaps 50 Apache men and women sitting in perfect silence. They were arranged according to some pattern he could not decipher, with the elderly near the spring and younger tribal members positioned in concentric rings extending outward. All wore traditional clothing decorated with beads, feathers, and intricate beadwork that caught the torchlight. What drew Samuel's attention most powerfully, however, were the two enormous figures standing on opposite sides of the spring. The Thunder Twins appeared even more imposing in the ceremonial setting than they had when stumbling across his ranch in search of water. They wore elaborate headdresses made of eagle feathers and elk antlers, and their bodies were painted with symbols that seemed to move and shift in the dancing torchlight. White Eagle rose from his position near the spring and gestured for Samuel to approach. As he dismounted and walked toward the circle, Samuel felt the eyes of every person present fixed upon him. There was no hostility in their gazes, but there was an intensity that made him acutely aware of the significance of whatever was about to take place. "Samuel Creek," White Eagle announced in a voice that carried clearly across the desert silence, "you have answered the call of the Thunder Twins. You have shown kindness to sacred beings without knowing their true nature. You have accepted their gifts without understanding their meaning. Tonight, you will learn what it means to be chosen by the spirits of earth and sky." Samuel was directed to stand in the center of the circle, between the two giants. Up close, he could see that their body paint was not simply decorative but formed a complex pattern of interconnected symbols that covered their skin from head to foot. The symbols seemed to pulse with their own light, creating the illusion that the twins were beings of living fire rather than flesh and blood. The ceremony began with the Thunder Twins speaking in unison, their deep voices creating harmonies that resonated through the ground beneath Samuel's feet. They spoke in the same unknown language he had heard during their first encounter, but now the words seemed to carry visual images as well as sound. As the giants spoke, Samuel saw flashes of scenes playing out in his mind: vast landscapes, ancient peoples, spirits walking among humans, the cyclical patterns of drought and abundance that governed desert life. White Eagle began to translate, though Samuel suspected the shaman was interpreting the meaning rather than providing literal translations of the words being spoken. The Thunder Twins speak of the old days, when the barriers between the spirit world and the human world were thin. They tell of a time when chosen humans served as bridges between the realms, helping to maintain the balance that kept both worlds healthy and strong. The twins continued their recitation, and more images flooded Samuel's mind. He saw great gatherings where Apaches and other tribes came together to resolve disputes through spiritual guidance. He saw springs flowing in the midst of terrible droughts, crops growing in soil that should have been barren, enemies laying down their weapons after experiencing visions of unity and peace. They speak of the breaking, White Eagle continued. How the coming of new peoples and new ways disrupted the ancient balance. How the bridges between worlds were destroyed, leaving both realms weakened and isolated. They tell of the long wait for new bridges to be built, for new humans to accept the calling of the spirits. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine as the implications of White Eagle's words became clear. The Thunder Twins were not simply honoring him for a single act of kindness. They were asking him to take on a role that had been empty for generations, to become a living connection between two different ways of understanding the world. The giants raised their hands simultaneously, and the assembled Apache began a low chant that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. The sound was hypnotic, creating rhythms that made Samuel's heartbeat synchronize with the collective voice of the tribe. As the chanting continued, Samuel felt his consciousness beginning to expand beyond the boundaries of his physical body. He found himself experiencing the memories and emotions of everyone present. Through White Eagle, he felt the weight of spiritual responsibility that came with serving as a bridge between worlds. Through Running Bear and Silent Wolf, he experienced the fierce loyalty that bound Apache warriors to their people and their land. Through the older women sitting near the spring, he felt the deep wisdom that came from understanding the cycles of life and death, growth and decay, that governed all existence. Most powerfully, through the Thunder Twins themselves, Samuel experienced something that defied description. He felt the vast loneliness of beings who existed between worlds, never fully belonging to either. He felt their endless search for humans capable of understanding and sharing their burden. He felt their joy at finally finding someone whose heart was open enough to accept the calling they offered. The chanting reached a crescendo, and, suddenly, Samuel was back in his own body, standing between the two giants as they extended their massive hands toward him. Without hesitation, Samuel reached out and grasped their hands in his own. The moment their skin made contact, electricity shot through his body with such intensity that he expected to be burned or killed. Instead, he felt transformed. Energy flowed into him from the giants, filling empty spaces in his spirit that he had not even known existed. The loneliness that had consumed him since Martha's death began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of connection that encompassed not just the humans present but all life in the surrounding desert. Samuel could suddenly sense the presence of every living thing within miles of the sacred pool. He felt the slow, patient consciousness of the ancient rock formations, the quick, bright awareness of hunting coyotes, the deep, flowing intelligence of underground springs. Most surprisingly, he could sense the spiritual energy that flowed through all these living things, connecting them in patterns of relationship that extended far beyond what was visible to ordinary perception. The Thunder Twins released his hands and stepped back, but the connection remained. Samuel realized that something fundamental had changed in his perception of reality. The world still looked the same, but he could now see the hidden currents of energy that moved beneath its surface. The desert was not the empty, hostile place it had seemed for 15 years. It was a living system pulsing with intelligence and purpose. White Eagle approached Samuel and placed a necklace around his neck. The necklace was made of the same materials Samuel had found in the leather pouch left on his porch: polished stones, carved bone, and sweet grass, but arranged in a pattern that seemed to focus and amplify the energy flowing through his body. "This is the sign of your calling," White Eagle explained. "As long as you wear this, you will be recognized by all Apache people as a bridge between worlds. You will be welcome at our ceremonies, consulted in our disputes, and protected by our warriors. In return, you will use the gifts you have received to help any who come to you in genuine need." Samuel looked around the circle at the faces watching him. No longer did they seem like strangers from an alien culture. He could sense their individual personalities, their hopes and fears, their love for their families and their land. The barriers that had separated him from them had dissolved, replaced by understanding that transcended cultural differences. One of the Thunder Twins spoke again, this time in heavily accented English. "Brother Samuel, you have accepted the calling of the spirits. Now you must learn to use the gifts that come with this calling. The drought that has plagued this land will end because of your presence here. Springs will flow, plants will grow, animals will return to places where they have been absent. This is not magic. This is the natural result of restoring the balance between the spirit world and the human world. The second giant continued the explanation. But, with these gifts comes responsibility. People will come to you seeking help with problems that cannot be solved by normal means. Some will be Apache, some will be white settlers, some will be Mexican traders or soldiers. You must help all equally, without regard for the color of their skin or the language they speak. The spirits recognize only the content of the human heart. Samuel felt the weight of what was being asked of him, but he also felt the strength to bear that weight. The energy flowing through him from the Thunder Twins was not just power but also wisdom, not just ability but also understanding of how to use that ability responsibly. What if I make mistakes? Samuel asked. What if I use these gifts wrongly? You will make mistakes, the first giant replied. All who carry the burden of bridging worlds make mistakes. But the spirits judge intentions, not results. As long as your heart remains open to all people and dedicated to healing the divisions between them, your mistakes will be forgiven and your understanding will grow. The ceremony continued for several more hours, with various tribal members approaching Samuel to offer blessings and share their own spiritual experiences. Samuel learned that many of the Apache present had their own gifts for communicating with spirits, healing the sick, or seeing events that had not yet occurred. He was not being asked to become something unique but rather to join a community of people who served as bridges between the visible and invisible worlds. As dawn approached, the formal ceremony concluded with all present sharing a meal of corn, beans, and dried meat that had been blessed by the Thunder Twins. Samuel found that his enhanced perception allowed him to taste not just the food but the love and intention with which it had been prepared. Every bite carried the spiritual essence of the people who had grown, harvested, and cooked it. When the meal was finished, most of the tribal members began to disperse, heading back to their camps and villages. White Eagle, his sons, and the Thunder Twins remained with Samuel as the sun rose over the eastern mountains. The ceremony is complete, White Eagle said, but your education is just beginning. The Thunder Twins will remain in this area for 7 more days, teaching you to use your new abilities. After that, they will return to the spirit realm, and you will be on your own. Samuel looked at the giants who had chosen him for this strange destiny. In the growing daylight, they appeared more human than they had during the ceremony, but he could still sense the enormous spiritual power they contained. Why me? He asked them. Why was I chosen for this? The first giant smiled, an expression that transformed his fierce features into something almost gentle. Because when we appeared at your fence dying of thirst, you saw only 2 men in need of help. You did not see our size or our strangeness. You did not calculate what helping us might cost you or what you might gain in return. You simply gave us what we needed because it was right to do so. Such purity of intention is rare among humans. It is the foundation upon which all spiritual gifts must be built. The second giant added, you have also known great loss and great loneliness. These experiences have opened your heart in ways that ease and comfort never could. The spirits choose their bridges from among those who understand suffering, because only such people can truly help others who suffer. As the Thunder Twins prepared to lead him away for his first day of training, Samuel looked back toward the west where his ranch lay hidden beyond the horizon. His old life seemed very small and isolated from this perspective. He was embarking on a journey that would connect him not only to the Apache people but to all the various peoples who struggled to survive in this harsh but beautiful land. For the first time since Martha's death, Samuel felt that his life had meaning beyond mere survival. The loneliness that had defined his existence for 7 years was ending, replaced by connections that would challenge him, sustain him, and ultimately transform him into someone worthy of the extraordinary trust that had been placed in him by beings who walked between the worlds of spirit and flesh. The sun climbed higher as Samuel began his education in the ancient arts of bridging worlds, little knowing that his first real test would come sooner than anyone expected, and would require him to use his new gifts in ways that would surprise even the Thunder Twins themselves. Samuel's training with the Thunder Twins began at sunrise on the day following the ceremony. For 7 days, the giants worked with him from dawn until dusk, teaching him to understand and control the spiritual energy that now flowed through him like a second bloodstream. The lessons took place at various locations around the sacred pool, each site chosen for its specific properties and spiritual significance. On the first day, the twins taught Samuel to sense water hidden beneath the desert floor. They showed him how to feel the subtle vibrations that indicated underground springs, how to distinguish between seasonal streams and permanent sources, and how to determine the depth and purity of hidden water. By the end of the day, Samuel could locate water sources with the same accuracy that had taken Apache scouts years to develop. The second day focused on communication with animals. The Thunder Twins explained that most creatures possessed a rudimentary spiritual awareness that could be accessed by humans with the proper training. Samuel learned to project feelings of safety and friendship toward wild animals, to understand their basic needs and concerns, and to negotiate simple agreements for mutual benefit. By evening, he could approach rattlesnakes without fear and convince hunting hawks to share information about distant travelers. Each subsequent day brought new skills and deeper understanding. Samuel learned to read the spiritual health of plants and animals, to sense the approach of weather changes days before they occurred, and to perceive the emotional and spiritual conditions of humans at considerable distances. Most importantly, he learned to serve as a conduit for spiritual energy, channeling power from the Thunder Twins and other spirit beings to heal physical and emotional wounds. The training was exhausting but exhilarating. Samuel felt as if he were reclaiming abilities he had possessed as a child but forgotten as he grew older and more focused on practical concerns. Each new skill seemed familiar once he learned it, as if it were a natural part of human capability that civilization had taught him to ignore. On the 7th day of training, as Samuel practiced channeling healing energy into a dying mesquite tree, one of the Thunder Twins suddenly stiffened and turned toward the southern horizon. The giant's expression grew grave as he extended his spiritual senses across the desert landscape. "Trouble comes," he announced to his twin and to Samuel. "Soldiers ride hard from the south, pursuing Apache raiders. Both groups will reach this area before sunset. There will be violence unless someone intervenes." The second giant nodded grimly. "This will be the first test of our new bridge. Samuel must choose whether to use his gifts to prevent bloodshed between his own people and his adopted people." Samuel felt his stomach tighten as he realized the implications of what the giants were telling him. Somewhere to the south, a group of Apache warriors was being pursued by cavalry soldiers, probably in retaliation for a raid on a settlement or ranch. Both groups were heading toward the sacred pool area, where their encounter would likely result in deaths on both sides. "Can you tell me more about what's happening?" Samuel asked. The first giant closed his eyes and extended his awareness southward. 6 Apache warriors, young men acting without the approval of their tribal council. They raided a Mexican trading post, killed 2 men, and took horses and supplies. Behind them, 12 cavalry soldiers led by a sergeant who has fought Apaches for many years. The soldiers are angry and will show no mercy if they catch the raiders. Samuel felt the weight of his new responsibilities settling on his shoulders. The Thunder Twins had told him he would need to help people from all backgrounds, but he had not expected to be tested so quickly or in such a dramatic way. How could he possibly prevent violence between 2 groups of armed men who considered each other enemies? "What am I supposed to do?" Samuel asked. "I can't stop bullets with spiritual energy." "Perhaps not," the second giant replied, "but you can stop the hatred that fires the bullets. You can create understanding where there is now only anger and fear. This is why bridges between worlds are necessary. Without them, conflicts escalate until they destroy everyone involved." The giants began walking toward the southern approach to the sacred pool, and Samuel followed, his mind racing as he tried to think of ways to prevent the coming confrontation. His new abilities allowed him to sense the approach of both groups, but he could not yet read their specific thoughts or emotions at such a distance. As they positioned themselves on a low ridge overlooking the route both groups would take, Samuel could see dust clouds rising from the desert floor several miles away. The Apache raiders were perhaps an hour ahead of their pursuers, but both groups were riding hard and would reach this area well before dark. "Tell me what you know about these particular men," Samuel said to the giants. If I'm going to help them, I need to understand who they are and what drives them. The first giant concentrated for several minutes, using his spiritual senses to examine the approaching groups. The Apache warriors are led by a young man called Broken Arrow. He is the son of a war chief who died fighting Mexican soldiers 3 years ago. Broken Arrow raids not for profit but to avenge his father's death. His followers are equally young and equally driven by grief and anger rather than practical needs. The cavalry sergeant is named Thomas Mitchell, the second giant continued. He has spent 5 years fighting Apaches on the frontier. His younger brother was killed in an Apache raid 2 years ago, and, since then, he has pursued every opportunity for revenge. Like Broken Arrow, he fights not from duty but from personal pain. Samuel absorbed this information and felt a glimmer of understanding. Both leaders were driven by grief and the desire for revenge. They were fighting not as representatives of their peoples but as individuals trying to heal wounds that violence had only made worse. I think I see what needs to happen, Samuel said slowly. But I'm going to need both of you to help me. The giants nodded, and Samuel began to explain his plan. It was risky and would require precise timing, but it offered the possibility of transforming a violent confrontation into something that might actually help both groups heal their emotional wounds. An hour later, the Apache raiders crested a small hill and rode down into the valley where the sacred pool lay hidden. Samuel watched them through his enhanced perception, noting their youth and the desperate quality of their movements. These were not hardened warriors but grieving sons and brothers lashing out at a world that had taken their loved ones from them. Broken Arrow, the leader, was perhaps 20 years old, with the lean build and intense eyes of someone who had seen too much violence too early in his life. His followers looked even younger, and Samuel could sense the fear beneath their bravado. They had committed themselves to a path of vengeance, but they were beginning to realize that this path led only to their own destruction. As the raiders approached the sacred pool, Samuel stepped out from behind the rocks where he had been hiding. The young Apaches immediately drew their weapons, but something in Samuel's calm demeanor and the presence of the Thunder Twins nearby gave them pause. I am Samuel Creek, he announced in the Apache language, which he found he could now speak fluently as a result of his spiritual bonding with the tribe. I am a bridge between worlds, chosen by the Thunder Twins to help all people who suffer. I know why you ride, and I know who pursues you. There is a way to end this that will honor your father's memory without requiring your own deaths. Broken Arrow studied Samuel suspiciously, clearly trying to decide whether this strange white man represented a threat or an opportunity. You speak our language, but you are not Apache. Why should we trust you? Because I have been where you are now, Samuel replied. I have lost someone I love to violence, and I have felt the same rage that drives you. But I have learned that revenge does not heal the wound of loss. It only creates new wounds that will pain you for the rest of your life. Before Broken Arrow could respond, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of Sergeant Mitchell and his cavalry patrol. The soldiers appeared at the crest of the same hill the raiders had descended minutes earlier, and Samuel could see Mitchell raising his hand to signal a charge. This was the critical moment. Samuel closed his eyes and reached out with his new abilities, projecting a wave of spiritual energy toward both groups. The energy carried feelings of peace and clarity, temporarily dampening the anger and fear that threatened to trigger violence. Both groups of men found themselves hesitating, weapons lowered, as an inexplicable calm settled over the valley. In that moment of stillness, Samuel called out in English to the cavalry patrol. Sergeant Mitchell. I am Samuel Creek, rancher and friend to the Apache people. These men wish to speak with you under a flag of truce. They have a proposal that may interest you. Mitchell urged his horse down the slope, his men following cautiously behind him. As he approached, Samuel could see the wariness and suspicion in the sergeant's weathered face. This was a man who had learned not to trust Apaches, but something about the spiritual energy Samuel was projecting made him willing to listen. What kind of proposal? Mitchell demanded, his hand resting on his pistol grip. Samuel looked from the sergeant to Broken Arrow, then spoke to both groups simultaneously, using English and Apache as needed. You are both here because you have lost people you love to violence. You both seek revenge because you believe it will ease your pain. But I tell you that revenge will only create more loss, more pain, more reason for your children to seek revenge in turn. The Thunder Twins stepped forward, their massive presence adding weight to Samuel's words. Both groups of men stared at the giants with a mixture of awe and fear, clearly recognizing that they were in the presence of beings beyond ordinary human experience. I propose a different kind of justice, Samuel continued. Let the young men who raided the trading post offer restitution for the harm they have caused. Let them work to repay the families of the dead and to rebuild what they destroyed. In exchange, let the soldiers accept this restitution and agree to protect those same families from future raids. That's not justice, Mitchell said harshly. Those men are killers. They belong in prison or on the end of a rope. And, when they are dead, Samuel replied, their families will seek revenge against you and yours. The cycle will continue until everyone is dead or too broken to fight anymore. Is that the legacy you want to leave your children? Samuel could feel the spiritual energy flowing through him, carrying his words directly into the hearts of the men present. Both groups were beginning to see beyond their immediate anger to the larger pattern of violence that trapped them all. Broken Arrow spoke for the first time since the soldiers had arrived. What kind of restitution do you speak of? Work, Samuel replied. Honest labor to rebuild what you destroyed and to create something new that benefits everyone. The trading post you raided serves both Mexican and Apache customers. Help rebuild it, but build it better, with facilities that both peoples can use safely. Show that Apache hands can create as well as destroy. One of the young cavalry soldiers spoke up unexpectedly. My brother was killed in an Apache raid last year. How does this help him? Samuel turned to face the young soldier, sensing the deep pain behind his words. Your brother is beyond help, but his death can still have meaning if it helps prevent other brothers from dying in the same way. The Apache warriors who killed him are probably dead now too, killed by other soldiers seeking revenge. When does it end? When do we stop creating orphans and widows? The spiritual energy Samuel was channeling reached a crescendo, and, for a moment, every person present experienced a vision of what their lives could be like if the cycle of violence was broken. They saw Apache and white children playing together, saw trading posts where all peoples were welcome, saw conflicts resolved through negotiation rather than bloodshed. The vision faded, but its impact remained. Mitchell dismounted from his horse and walked slowly toward Broken Arrow, his hand extended in a gesture of peace rather than war. I can't promise the army will accept this arrangement, Mitchell said carefully, but I'm willing to try it if these men are sincere about making amends. Broken Arrow looked at his followers, then back at Mitchell. We are tired of running and fighting. If there is a way to honor our dead without joining them, we will take it. Samuel felt a surge of relief and gratitude as he realized his first major test as a bridge between worlds had been successful. The immediate threat of violence had been averted, and both groups had been given a chance to break free from the cycle of revenge that had trapped them. But, as the two groups began to negotiate the specific terms of their agreement, Samuel sensed that larger forces were already moving in response to what had happened here. Word of this peaceful resolution would spread, bringing both opportunities and challenges that would test his abilities in new ways. The Thunder Twins approached him as the former enemies worked out details of cooperation and restitution. You have done well, the first giant said. The bridge between worlds is strong in you. But this is only the beginning. Greater tests await, tests that will require all your strength and wisdom. Samuel nodded, understanding that his quiet life as an isolated rancher was now permanently in the past. He had accepted the calling of the spirits, and that calling would lead him into conflicts and responsibilities he could not yet imagine. As the sun set over the sacred pool, former enemies shared food and planned a future that none of them had thought possible that morning. Samuel watched them with a mixture of pride and apprehension, knowing that he had helped create something good, but also knowing that his real work was just beginning. 6 months after the peaceful resolution at the sacred pool, Samuel's life had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. His small ranch had become a neutral meeting ground where Apaches, Mexican traders, cavalry soldiers, and white settlers came to resolve disputes that might otherwise have led to violence. Word of the spirit man who could broker peace between enemies had spread throughout the territory, bringing a steady stream of visitors to his door. Samuel had learned to use his spiritual gifts with increasing skill and confidence. He could now sense deception and hidden motives in the people who came to him for help, allowing him to address the real sources of conflicts rather than just their surface manifestations. More importantly, he had learned to project feelings of understanding and empathy that helped opposing parties see past their differences to their common humanity. The Thunder Twins had returned to the spirit realm as promised, but their influence remained strong in Samuel's life. They appeared to him in dreams and visions, offering guidance when he faced particularly difficult situations. They had also left him with enhanced abilities that continued to develop as he used them. Samuel could now communicate telepathically with animals, sense approaching weather changes weeks in advance, and locate water sources from distances of many miles. These abilities had made his ranch remarkably prosperous. His cattle were healthier and more numerous than ever before, his crops grew despite irregular rainfall, and his well had become a reliable source of fresh water for travelers crossing the desert. Samuel shared these resources freely with anyone in need, understanding that abundance was meant to be circulated rather than hoarded. But the most significant change in Samuel's life was the community that had grown up around his ranch. What had begun as occasional visits from people seeking his help had evolved into a permanent settlement of families from various backgrounds who chose to live near the bridge between worlds. White Eagle and his extended family had been the first to establish a camp within walking distance of Samuel's house. The old shaman had appointed himself as Samuel's advisor and teacher, helping him understand Apache customs and spiritual practices. White Eagle's sons, Running Bear and Silent Wolf, had become Samuel's closest friends and protectors, watching over him during his travels and helping him navigate the complex politics of frontier life. A Mexican family named the Herreras had settled nearby after Samuel helped them recover their daughter from Apache kidnappers through negotiation rather than violence. Carlos Herrera had established a trading post that served customers from all ethnic backgrounds, creating a neutral zone where former enemies could conduct business safely. Several white families had also joined the growing community, drawn by the safety and prosperity that seemed to surround Samuel's ranch. Among them was a young schoolteacher named Emma Patterson, who had arrived 3 months earlier to establish a school that would serve children from all the families in the settlement. Emma's presence had awakened feelings in Samuel that he had thought died with Martha. She was intelligent, kind, and courageous, having left a comfortable life in Boston to bring education to frontier children. More importantly, she seemed to understand and accept Samuel's unusual calling without fear or superstition. On a warm spring morning, Samuel was working in his expanded vegetable garden when he sensed riders approaching from the north. His enhanced perception told him these were not ordinary travelers. The spiritual energy surrounding them felt different, more complex and conflicted than anything he had encountered before. As the riders came into view, Samuel counted 12 men wearing the blue uniforms of cavalry officers rather than enlisted soldiers. At their head rode a man whose bearing and insignia marked him as someone of considerable rank and authority. Even from a distance, Samuel could sense the intensity of purpose that drove this group. The officer leading the patrol was Colonel William Hayes, a career military man with 20 years of experience fighting Indians on various frontiers. Hayes had been sent by the War Department to investigate reports of an unauthorized peace agreement between Apache raiders and cavalry units in his jurisdiction. If the reports were true, he intended to arrest everyone involved for conduct unbecoming and dereliction of duty. Samuel met the patrol at his gate, recognizing immediately that this encounter would be more challenging than most. Colonel Hayes radiated the kind of rigid authority that brooked no compromise or accommodation. This was a man who saw the world in terms of military discipline and legal regulations, with little tolerance for irregular solutions to complex problems. "You are Samuel Creek?" Hayes demanded without dismounting. "I am. How can I help you, Colonel?" Hayes studied Samuel with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating potential threats. "I'm here to investigate reports of unauthorized negotiations between military personnel and hostile Apache forces. I'm told these negotiations took place on your property and were conducted under your supervision." Samuel had been expecting this confrontation for months. The peaceful resolution he had helped broker between Broken Arrow's raiders and Sergeant Mitchell's patrol had worked better than anyone had anticipated. The young Apache warriors had indeed made full restitution for their raid, working alongside Mexican laborers to rebuild the trading post they had attacked. More importantly, they had become informal ambassadors between their people and the white settlements, preventing several potential conflicts through early communication and negotiation. But Samuel had known that military bureaucracy would eventually catch up with these irregular arrangements. The army operated according to strict protocols that did not include consulting civilian mediators or accepting alternatives to force when dealing with Indian troubles. The negotiations you refer to prevented the deaths of at least 18 men, Samuel replied calmly. Apache and cavalry alike. The result has been 6 months of peace in an area that previously saw violence every few weeks. I would think the army would be pleased with such results. The army is pleased with results achieved through proper channels and legal authority, Hayes snapped. What you did was interfere with military operations and encourage soldiers to disobey direct orders to apprehend hostile Indians. Such interference cannot be tolerated, regardless of its apparent success. Samuel could sense the deeper motivations driving Hayes's hostility. The colonel genuinely believed in military discipline as the foundation of civilization, but he was also angry about being bypassed by subordinates who had chosen to trust an eccentric rancher over official protocols. More than that, Hayes was afraid that irregular peace arrangements might spread, undermining the army's authority and making his own position redundant. Would you like to see what those negotiations have accomplished? Samuel asked. The trading post that was rebuilt is operating more successfully than ever before. The Apache families involved have moved away from raiding toward legitimate trade. The cavalry units have been able to focus on genuine threats rather than chasing grief-stricken young men across the desert. Hayes's expression grew even more stern. I'm not here to evaluate the success of unauthorized operations, Mr. Creek. I'm here to arrest you and Sergeant Mitchell for conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. You will accompany me to the territorial capital, where you will face charges for interfering with military operations. Samuel had anticipated this possibility and prepared for it. He extended his enhanced senses throughout the growing settlement around his ranch, touching the minds of the people who had chosen to build their lives in this place of peace and cooperation. What he sensed strengthened his resolve to resist Hayes's attempt to destroy what they had all worked to create. Colonel Hayes, before you take any action that might disrupt the peace we've built here, I'd like you to meet some of the people who have benefited from those irregular negotiations you disapprove of. Without waiting for Hayes's permission, Samuel called out in Apache, Spanish, and English, summoning representatives of the various communities that had grown around his ranch. Within minutes, a diverse crowd had gathered near the gate, including White Eagle, Carlos Herrera, Emma Patterson, and several of the young Apache warriors who had participated in the original peaceful resolution. Hayes looked at the mixed crowd with obvious disapproval, but Samuel could sense his uncertainty growing as he realized the complexity of what he was confronting. This was not simply a case of one eccentric civilian interfering with military operations. This was an entire community that had organized itself around principles that challenged the military's approach to frontier conflicts. Emma Patterson stepped forward, her voice carrying the clear authority of an educated woman accustomed to speaking in public. Colonel Hayes, I am Emma Patterson, and I teach the children of this community. Among my students are Apache children, Mexican children, and the children of white settlers. They play together, learn together, and grow up seeing each other as friends rather than enemies. This is possible only because Mr. Creek created a place where their parents could resolve their differences through understanding rather than violence. White Eagle spoke next, his aged voice carrying the weight of traditional authority. Colonel, I have been a shaman among my people for 40 years. I have seen many wars, many attempts at peace through treaties and negotiations conducted in distant places by men who never met the people they claimed to represent. None of those arrangements lasted because they were based on fear and force rather than genuine understanding. What Samuel Creek has created here is different because it comes from the heart rather than from regulations written by bureaucrats. One of the former Apache raiders, a young man Samuel had helped transform from an angry avenger into a skilled craftsman, approached Hayes's horse and spoke in careful English. Colonel, 6 months ago I would have tried to kill you and your soldiers without hesitation. Today, I ask only that you do not destroy the chance for peace that this man has given to all of us. My father died fighting cavalry soldiers because there was no other way to resolve our differences. My son will not have to make that same choice because of what we have built here. Samuel could sense Hayes's internal struggle as he listened to these testimonies. The colonel's rigid worldview was being challenged by evidence that contradicted his basic assumptions about frontier life and military necessity. Part of him recognized the value of what had been accomplished at Samuel's ranch, but accepting that value would require him to question the entire system of authority and control that had defined his career. These are all very touching sentiments, Hayes said finally, but the fact remains that unauthorized negotiations with hostile Indians violate military law and territorial regulations. Good intentions do not excuse illegal actions. Samuel stepped closer to Hayes's horse, extending his spiritual perception to read the colonel's deeper emotions. Beneath the rigid authority and bureaucratic concerns, he sensed a profound loneliness and a deep fear of chaos. Hayes had devoted his life to military service because he believed that only strict discipline and unwavering authority could prevent civilization from sliding back into barbarism. "Colonel Hayes," Samuel said quietly, "may I ask you about your family? Do you have children?" Hayes stiffened at the personal question, but something in Samuel's tone made him answer. "I have a son. He's 16 years old, attending a military academy back east. And you hope that by the time he's old enough to serve on the frontier, there will be peace here? That he won't have to fight the same wars you've been fighting?" "Of course I hope that," Hayes admitted. "But peace will come through military victory and the establishment of law and order, not through this." He gestured at the diverse crowd surrounding his patrol. Samuel could see the opening he needed. Hayes was not simply a rigid bureaucrat but a father who wanted a better future for his son. That emotional connection could be the bridge that allowed the colonel to see past his preconceptions to the reality of what was happening at the ranch. "Colonel, everything we've accomplished here is based on one simple principle, that people from different backgrounds can learn to understand each other if they have a safe place to do that learning. Your son is going to inherit the frontier whether we leave him a legacy of endless war or the beginnings of lasting peace. Which legacy would you prefer to give him?" Hayes was silent for several minutes, his gaze moving from the mixed crowd to the prosperous buildings of the settlement to the peaceful landscape that surrounded them. Samuel could sense the internal battle being fought as the colonel's personal desires warred with his professional obligations. Finally, Hayes spoke in a voice that had lost much of its harsh authority. "Mr. Creek, what you've accomplished here may be admirable, but it cannot be officially recognized or sanctioned. The Army operates according to regulations that exist for good reasons. I cannot simply ignore those regulations because one irregular arrangement appears to have worked." "I understand your position," Samuel replied. "But I ask you to consider a different approach. Instead of arresting the people who created this peace, why not study what we've done and see if it can be adapted to work within military regulations? You have the authority to conduct experiments in frontier administration. Use that authority to test whether cooperation and understanding might be more effective than force and fear." Hayes looked again at the faces surrounding him, seeing in them a hope and prosperity that contrasted sharply with the fear and suspicion that characterized most frontier communities. Despite his commitment to military protocol, he could not deny the evidence of his own eyes. "I need time to consider this situation," Hayes said finally. "I will not make any arrests today, but I expect a full report of your activities and methods within 1 week. If I determine that your approach has merit and can be conducted within legal bounds, I may be willing to recommend an official policy change. If not, I will return with orders to shut down this operation permanently." As Hayes and his patrol rode away, Samuel felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had won a temporary victory, but the real test would come when the colonel filed his report with territorial and federal authorities. The future of the community they had built would depend on whether military bureaucracy could adapt to accommodate unconventional success. That evening, as Samuel sat on his porch watching the sun set over the diverse settlement that had grown around his ranch, Emma Patterson joined him with 2 cups of coffee. She had become his closest confidant over the past months, the person with whom he could share the burdens and uncertainties of his unusual calling. "Do you think he'll support us?" Emma asked, settling into the chair beside him. I think Colonel Hayes is a good man trapped in a rigid system, Samuel replied. Whether he can find a way to reconcile his conscience with his duty remains to be seen. Emma was quiet for a moment, then reached over and took his hand. Samuel, regardless of what happens with the army, you've already accomplished something remarkable here. You've shown that people from different backgrounds can live together in peace and prosperity. That knowledge can't be taken away, even if this particular community is forced to disperse. Samuel squeezed her hand, drawing comfort from her steady presence. Over the past months, he had come to realize that his feelings for Emma went far beyond friendship, and he sensed that she felt the same way about him. But the uncertainty surrounding his future made him hesitant to speak of love or make commitments he might not be able to keep. The Thunder Twins told me that being a bridge between worlds would require sacrifices, Samuel said. I'm beginning to understand what they meant. Every choice I make affects not just my own life but the lives of everyone who has chosen to trust in what we're building here. 3 days later, a messenger arrived with news that would change everything once again. Colonel Hayes had submitted his report to territorial headquarters, recommending that Samuel's methods be studied and possibly adopted as official policy for dealing with frontier conflicts. But the report had been intercepted by politicians who saw any accommodation with Indians as a threat to their plans for territorial development. Instead of the study Hayes had recommended, territorial authorities were sending a much larger military force with orders to arrest Samuel and disperse the integrated settlement around his ranch. The peaceful experiment that had seemed so successful was about to face its greatest test. Samuel gathered the leaders of the various communities around his ranch and shared the news. The mood was somber as people realized they would soon be forced to choose between abandoning the life they had built together or risking imprisonment and violence by resisting government authority. White Eagle spoke for many when he said, "The Thunder Twins chose you not because the path would be easy, but because you have the strength to walk it even when it leads through darkness. Whatever comes, we will face it together." As Samuel looked around at the faces of the people who had become his family, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the gifts he had been given and the purpose he had found. The immediate future might be uncertain, but the seeds of understanding and cooperation they had planted would continue to grow, even if this particular community was scattered to the winds. The Thunder Twins had told him that bridges between worlds must sometimes be rebuilt many times before they became permanent. Samuel was beginning to understand that his true calling was not to create one perfect community but to demonstrate repeatedly that peace and cooperation were possible, even in the most challenging circumstances. The legend of the lonely rancher who gave water to 2 giant twins had already begun to spread throughout the territory, carried by traders, soldiers, and settlers who had witnessed or heard about the remarkable events at his ranch. That story would survive whatever happened in the coming days, inspiring others to seek their own ways of bridging the divides between different peoples and cultures. Samuel looked toward the eastern horizon where he had first seen the Thunder Twins approaching his fence line, and he smiled. The journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness was far from over, but he finally understood that the destination had never been as important as the courage to keep walking the path, wherever it might lead.